So good evening, everyone. I am sure that you have had such rich discussions. The last thing you want is to hear again about the discussions, but on the other hand, I also know how committed you are, so you probably can't get enough. So I'm delighted that at least some of you are here. And this is going to be very much a free-flowing conversation, so that we also want the audience to participate and try to step back from the specificity of sites to some of the broader questions. And that's what Jeff was particularly interested in. Now, you've met most of my colleagues here, but let me just start with Dr. Vincent Michael, who is the Director of Historic Preservation at the School of Art Institute of Chicago Trust, and he's a trustee of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Their bios are in your program book, so I won't go through all of the details. My very dear friend, Mr. S.K. Mishra, he's the chairman of Indian Trust for Rural Heritage and Development and vice chairman of International National Trust Organization. Confusing, International National, right? I must say that S.K. and I go back a long, long ways when we were both young. 1985 Festival of India, if some of you participated, it would not have happened were it not for him. That's the truth. Next to him is Dr. Jyoti Hoskarhar, and she is the Director of Sustainable Urbanism International at Columbia University in New York and Bangalore, India. And she has been doing a tremendous amount of work in this field, and some of you were in her session, so we'll come back to that. And Jeff Morgan needs no introduction. So before we start, I thought it'd be good if Vince and Jyoti could just give us a quick synopsis of the two sessions, because some of you were there, but we were supposed to do it prior to this, and things got delayed. So if you can do a 2-minute
Sure.
summary.
Okay, well, we had several speakers, and I think we focused a lot on community and education issues. A lot of what we do is living heritage. It's not monuments, but it's really community. We talked about how do you develop community, not just from a tourism angle, but really create the community as a partner. And we had interesting models where indigenous communities were actually considered as stakeholders in the discussion. So good conservation planning includes the entire community, the scholarly community, archaeological community, conservation community, but also the local community. We talked about different ways to educate the community, not just about stewardship and the importance of conservation itself, but also what ways you could facilitate. And we had some really interesting discussion about different techniques for facilitating that. We talked about tourism as well, both how do you determine the carrying capacity of a place and make a tourism plan that is sensitive to the local community, and also generating capital out of heritage, but also we had an economist who reminded us that heritage is a form of capital itself. It's not counted the same way as other forms, but it's important. And we also talked about, building a better tourist, getting people to get involved in conservation as something they want to do. So really approach it from the demand side and not the regulatory side. Finally, we found some interesting synergies between tangible and intangible heritage. One of the fascinating things is that sometimes looking at a building or a structure, learning how it was built, you actually learn how to best conserve it. That when we save something, we not only save its artistic value, but also learning how to build again, and maybe traditional intangible construction techniques that have been passed along. So that's a quick summary of what we discussed.
Thank you. Jyoti?
Okay. We talked about a range of issues around financing, sustainability of the financing, and the economics of heritage, and public-private partnerships. We had 4 excellent presentations, 2 from China and 2 on India. And one of the things that came about was the first question that was, the first sort of theme that was most valuable that came out of this was a question of who the financing came from and what the financing was for, in the sense whether it was a catalyst that then brought in other funds, or it was something that completely took care of all of the conservation aspects, and what the future in terms of the sustainability of these were. And so it seemed like most of the projects that were discussed, and focused more on funding that had, had substantial funding either from government or from a foundation, trust, or World Bank. For instance, it was an Aga Khan Trust that was an initial funding, or a Global Heritage Fund initial funding, and also the World Bank funding. But there were some projects, such as what Mr. Mishra talked about, which had which brought in a lot of government funds itself. And then additional funds were in all of the cases, were brought in by private sector, by corporates, or in larger number of cases by small philanthropists or foundations, as well as some individuals also who were like homeowners who were contributing a certain portion, and so on. A second question that I think that was important that came out of our discussions had to do with the question of whether we're talking about the financing, when we talk about the economics of heritage, are we talking about the economics of financing the conservation, or are we talking about the development benefits, the economic development benefits of heritage? And the general sense that came out of our discussion was that really they were both integrated, and that the most successful conservation projects are ones that don't make a distinction between the two, or rather integrate both very well. And that was so that one couldn't say that the development benefits were somehow separate from the financing of the heritage, that the two had to be very closely married for a successful project. A third question rather it was an observation, was that to some extent because we were talking about cases in China and India, we were looking more at emerging economies rather than at cases, like what were the lessons for places where there were fewer sort of institutional arrangements or fewer possibilities, and where there wasn't this kind of philanthropist or private contributions possible. What were the possibilities? What other kinds of, and whether there could be other types of private interventions that could be encouraged, and why there are fewer of them, what needed to be done, for instance, of, say, mining industries or petroleum industries or tours and tour operators. What were the pluses and minuses of bringing some of these in, and why are they less involved? Is it... So I think broadly these were some, there was a whole lot of other questions also, but I'm not going to talk about everything, on how we assess these and how we can look at sustainability in different dimensions and so on, but I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. I think that both of these summaries actually lead us to some of the more macro questions. I do want to come back to funding a little bit later, but it seems to me the very first question we should be thinking about is that when we talk about human development, which is something you all have been discussing all day, why is it that in fact in the Millennium Development Goals of the UN, there is not a single word about cultural heritage preservation as part of human development goals? Now we might just say, well, they're not paying attention to us. But what is it in the field that we all could do to make the case that this is as important as environmental conservation, education, or anything else? Why is it that it's not there? And how might we do it?
Well, UNESCO has recognized that culture is the fourth pillar of sustainability. So I think what we need to do is sort of connect the larger idea of culture, which people might just associate with art making or handicrafts or music, to cultural heritage.
Right.
So I think that's the first bridge, is to really say that cultural heritage includes tangible, intangible, the full range of culture. We're just also looking at it from a historic point of view.
And why does it matter? Why does it matter that historical perspective as we go forward? We all know that, but how do we make that case to people who are not part of our conversation? Jyoti?
Yeah, actually, if I could jump in on this, the question you've asked, Vishaka, is very close to my heart and very close to my work, because one of the things I've been working with the cultural sector in UNESCO has been on the question of culture and development. Mm-hmm. And precisely this question of why is culture not part of the Millennium Development Goals, why is it not? And I think that one of the reasons that it hasn't been is because if you look at the way that development measures, including, the human development index looks at education and health, but we don't have adequate, easy measures for cultural achievements or to see the value of the cultural inputs. And so that makes it harder to be able to have hard data to demonstrate the value of culture. In addition to which, a lot of the benefits, if you look at economic and non-economic benefits, a lot of what culture offers are non-economic benefits that cultural heritage offers, where, for instance, social cohesion or dialogue or peace, providing a basis for development, because you can't undertake development in a place that's war-torn. It has to be first. So culture plays a very significant role in all of these. In addition to which, tourism, for instance, the only benefits that are typically counted are the tourism dollars or the culture industries and the so the economic benefits, the monetized benefits are counted. But the non-monetized benefits, we don't have adequate ways of demonstrating those benefits. And I think that's a major part of it.
Even at the national level, government level, very little attention was paid to heritage. In the case of India, I suppose it was because there were other pressing priorities, health, education, various other things, social issues. And heritage has come into its own only during the last 10 or 15 years, really. And I think for that, we must give credit to Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi. Because you see, you had the ASI, which was the only organization, government organization, responsible for looking after protected monuments. And Mrs. Gandhi felt that apart from the protected monuments, which is about 3,500 all over the country, there are thousands of other historic sites, monuments that required attention. And she felt there was need for a non-governmental organization to focus on that. And for that reason, the National Trust, based on the National Trust in England, was set up in
Intact, yeah.
And I was associated with that as chairman for the last 10 years. So Intact developed its own philosophy of prioritizing, of documenting, and developing technical skills, having a core of conservation architects. And in fact, conservation architecture itself is a recent phenomenon. In fact, still in many architectural schools is not a subject. So, but I think now that the importance has been realized, it's taking off in a big way, and the public awareness is developing. Earlier, that public awareness was not developing. Now, I might mention earlier, there was very little awareness about environmental issues in India. Now, everybody is conscious about the environment. Everybody, even plastic.
That's actually a good model for us,
Yeah.
that what the environmental movement has done.
So I think
that it's central to our existence to think about. At least most people think so.
exactly.
There's some people
So
don't.
now, if you consider that, I think now we're in the takeoff stage, and I personally think the future is bright. Even the state governments are becoming aware of heritage issues and all.
Right. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to tie into what Jyoti said about how you can measure health and education. I was thinking, well, when you measure education, is it really equal? You can measure literacy, perhaps,
Right.
and you can measure how many grades completed, but what's in those grades? One of our presentations today, Agnes Shu, talked about Uzbekistan, and they really have this incredible stewardship of their intangible and tangible heritage, and she explained part of it. She said it's an unusual case. They have mandatory education, and they have huge literacy rate. So the education was actually tied to more appreciation of cultural heritage.
I was just going to come back to education. That it seems to me that somehow in so many developing countries, but especially in India and even China, not in Japan, but in so many of these countries, actually learning about heritage through the sites. What could be the role of education that we can actually cherish and value these sites so that there is some inculcation and who is doing it best, and then try to measure it, that when people pay attention to it, what else happens in that neighborhood? Does it have other kinds of cleanliness? Does it have other kinds of impact? And how do we measure that? So the education and the impact of that education on sites. Thoughts?
The challenge is measuring.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the reasons that Jeff and GHF, we've started this idea of doing a new heritage economics is because we need more measurement systems. So I don't have the answer, except I know we need more.
Right.
And so far as education is concerned, I think it has to start at the primary level.
Exactly.
And there is need for changing the curriculum.
Right.
The curriculums are outdated. And we must start with the curriculum, involve kids at that stage, develop in them a respect and love for their heritage. Now they know very little about it.
Right.
And you can start from the local level, what is there in their area
Exactly.
that needs to be preserved, because they can relate to that.
Well, you know, I have to say I went to a Gandhian school, not a convent, right? Not a school that most kids would go to, but is based on Shantiniketan. In the first grade, we would go to all the architecture sites of Ahmedabad, and we would learn about those sites and the history. And then the third grade was the state, and the fourth grade was further out. And I saw all of India that way. And the thing is that it leaves an impression on your mind because you really learn something from doing something. And yet, today the tests are such that nobody actually pays attention to this stuff. So one is, so you say change the curriculum. So how are we going to do that? What does it take? Okay, is anybody done it? Is there a best example? I mean, if Uzbekistan has done it, let's find out.
Well, we are doing it at the primary level in the villages where we are starting the school. We have a team of professional educationists who are working on that. And I might mention from my experience in INTAC that INTAC had an interaction with a large number of schools, and about 1,000 clubs were set up. And there was constant interaction through the newsletter, and they were given a passport sort of thing. Each one was to write, okay, in my area, who's the local hero whom you're there, or what is the biggest, the oldest tree in your area, or what monument. So, and we're getting responses. And then through painting competitions of the local, that also developed an interest in the kids. So there was a painting competition which we had organized on World Heritage Sites in India. So we came up with beautiful...
Now see, that needs measurement in terms of places where they don't do it. What's the difference? And how do sites get preserved? How does it change, right? So that would be one of the things.
I mean, I think that these examples are marvelous. And I wasn't going to talk so much about how to integrate it into curriculum or education, but really at the other end, to look at our profession. When I say our profession, I mean people who are engaged with heritage in some way or the other, and with its as professionals. And I think that part of it is that, and I'm referring also here to the UNESCO's new recommendation on historic urban landscapes, which is really an effort to integrate conservation with development. Because I think a purist approach is how it started. I mean, the whole conservation idea comes out of this kind of elitism and purity, which is completely
contrary. It's about the site.
It's about the site and about the aesthetic sort of the aesthetic attributes of the site, and which is marvelous. But at the same time, to look at development and to see how to integrate development with this, so that it's not only pure aestheticization, I think is also an important part of it, because otherwise we're not going to be able to make this leap where we can begin to integrate it into people's everyday lives and make it meaningful. It remains separate from people's lives, I think.
Well, a good example is, for the environment, it's easy for me to get involved because I can go out and plant a tree, right? And so I can personalize it. And it's harder with the heritage because that's a big thing. And, that's what the government does. And it's really now where you see national trusts and these where they're involving the communities in Main Street, where small grants program where you give $45,000 to Toledo, Ohio, or this could be in India or wherever, and suddenly 75 lawyers, architects, people come together. They do $500,000 worth of pro bono work. And then they raise the money, and then they restore the building. And somehow we have to get, in these other countries, empower people in those countries. They have to feel empowered enough that they can get together and do that when they're in Cambodia or in Guatemala or in Laos, and it's a harder
See,
jump.
the question is scaling as well, right? I mean, the big question is that conservation first began with the ASI type model, preserve the monuments, make sure they survive, and that was it. Some of us who are art historians also worry a lot that lots of people get involved in this, but they have no sense of history, and that's a problem too. But then the next thing is that you're doing one site at a time. As Jeff and I were saying, there are not enough institutions involved already. So how do we scale this movement up? That would be the question. And what we all can do together to scale it up so that it does get to the level of the environmental movement in a way.
I mean, I think Jeff is right that you need to figure out ways to involve people. Part of our legacy here is this idea of sites, and ASI is a good example. And unfortunately, I'm going to venture that there is sort of a Western example of removing a monument from the economic everyday. So you remove it from the economy, you set it up as a special thing. And I think we could actually take an Asian model. A place like Bantai Chamar, when you were, in the Khmer Empire, you built a sacred site, and it became the economic site and the population site. It wasn't separated from the economy, it created the economy. I think we should go back to that idea.
As is true of Khajuraho and other places. These were capitals that were used. So then how do you inject that back in and develop that would be the question. That brings us also to the question of tourism that I know you all have talked about, and economics of a site. In terms of, often we do say that if it's especially farther away, the tourism will bring dollars. But I know you all talked about how do you create other economies around there, and what would that do, and where are the best examples of that? So this economic development and site preservation come together, and what are the dangers when you have too many people start coming to places?
In fact, I think GHF, pardon my saying so, placing too much emphasis on tourism, on the returns from tourism. You are ignoring the community. Because if there is a certain area where, yes, we do not want large-scale tourism,
Right, exactly.
so you're not going to get those benefits. It may be over a long period, but because you're not getting it, you're certainly not going to fund that, or you're not going to give it priority. So the community suffers. So your approach should be more humanistic approach. The development, not what you're going to get the economic immediate returns. You should think in terms of how the community is going to benefit over a long-term period. And I would caution GHF that you must modify your approach. You're being too monument-centric, too site-centric. Well, you have to have a balance between the two, and take up those areas also where you're not going to get economic returns in terms of returns from tourism or something. So that is an investment in human resources.
With a longer term horizon to sustain the economic sustain it. The tourism, the visitation is what the underlying is. If you have, there's two things that we look for. One is that you're going to have enough visitors to start bringing in money in to pay for the maintenance and the operations, where, as opposed to a deficit. The other is having a community nearby that can benefit. So Merv in Turkmenistan, way out there, it's a 2-hour drive from any human. Is that the place that you could have sustainability? Very hard.
No, but sustainability in one particular case, you know what I'm referring to, is, well, you may not get enough revenues from tourism to sustain it. But are there other ways of sustainability?
Right. Exactly.
If
That's
there
the
are-
issue.
I'd like to know.
Yeah.
I've had a hard time finding any others.
No, in this case, if there is a firm commitment, say from the government, that these monuments or temples are ignored, neglected, you have come in, you have acted as a catalyst, other agents have come in, and they are restoring. Now they realize the responsibility that after this is done, the first step, they will take the responsibility of maintaining it. It is their primary responsibility after it. Similarly, for the developmental aspects, they are committed not only just to providing the initial giving the push, but on a sustaining basis that is included in their plan. And they also get funding from the government of India for that purpose. So I have no doubt about it that these projects will be totally sustainable, and forget incomes from tourism. You're not going to get any income from tourism.
Well,
I was,
there you go.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
no, I was just going to, I think that I was going to add to some parts of what you were saying, which is to do with the human development aspect as opposed to the tourism aspect, because I think that, I mean, I'm talking also from the work that we've been doing in southern India, where the concept we're working with is there is tourism, some tourism, but we're not looking for big international tourism. We're looking really, I mean, there's a lot of pilgrims who come in and a lot of regional tourism. There's school children, busloads of them, and there's not enough support for these people. And so being able to provide infrastructure at different levels also enables them to not perform heritage as we were
Right.
talking about,
Right.
but to, and also giving people a lot of possibilities. Often we find in India there's a tendency, for instance, and then this is true in many other places, where we're quick to tell people what not to do, but we don't give very many
Yes.
options on what they could do. And so being able to generate a variety of these at a local level then creates the possibilities of a ripple effect. Because if you're going in and we're providing, for instance, a concept where you're not only looking at conservation of a structure, but of looking at reviving sort of a way of building, and you're giving possibilities and reviving the craftsmanship and giving them markets that they can then repair with those kinds of techniques which are dying out because nobody is hiring them, then you're regenerating and creating markets that allows that to sort of, so what we're looking at then is really regenerating the processes by which the town can function and have meaningful heritage value rather than just the physical fabric alone. And in terms of scaling up, I think that something like that takes then scaling up not only in terms of repeating such a thing in many other local places, but in looking at the institutional arrangements. Because in doing something like this, what we find is that the government agencies are not used to coordinating with each other. The state level has to work with the local level. National level, there are certain kinds of regulations and requirements into which, so being able to then address heritage regulations at a national level, heritage regulations at a state level, looking at the local level regulations and seeing how that kind of institutional engagement we find, and then looking at UNESCO and international regulations, this kind of sort of local to global connection, I think, is an important way we can scale up with our professional expertise.
I wanted to add, if you remember Han Lee's presentation on Pingyao, part of the goal of the newest project is to restore these courtyard houses, and it's a physical restoration to how they appeared originally, but it's actually not for tourism purely. It is to recreate sort of community parkland, recreate family space that historically existed there. So it's really, I would see the community as the first, source there, and that could generate value in the community in a lot of ways, economic and otherwise, that was not dependent on tourism.
Exactly.
It seems to me that the other question about funding that one might think about is that you have government sources in the local level and the state level, in some states and countries more than others. Then you have international organizations like the Global Heritage Fund or World Monument Fund coming in. What is the situation on the ground in terms of local support, local philanthropy for preservation, when as now in places like China, India, but also Indonesia, there is substantial amount of money that's being generated. And there are lots of people who are well-to-do. So your perception on what's the on-the-ground reality for local philanthropy for such projects?
I hope things are changing because where you're from, Ahmedabad, you can remember growing up, and there were hundreds of favelas and beautiful places
Right.
to visit, and now it's gone.
Right.
Everything,
Right.
except maybe Umang's
Right.
one favela that he restored and
about
2
4.
heritage
Yeah, yeah.
hotels. Yes.
Yeah.
And so we hope, I mean, that's the situation we're faced with is can we generate that interest? And I found if the project is significant enough and it's a national pride, we can get that. The UNESCO World Heritage has given us that lever. in a place like, well, we were in Ciudad Perdida last week in Colombia. It's but suddenly the people, there's 14 people that are getting together in Colombia. This is our national patrimony.
Just private money.
Private money, and they're willing to come in at $100,000 a piece. That type of level of interest and get involved. It's not really just the money. Will they be? And in India is a good example. You have so many very intelligent, smart people like Feroza Godrej and the Godrej and many others that are involved. And they have the big thing that they're missing is they're missing the tools and the visioning that they can get it done. It's very frustrating. It's a very complex, long-term process. And you have to have somehow a process and a glue like INTAC or IT, RHD, and these organizations to shepherd and everyone work together. I think you have to have some way to have people work together. What we haven't been able, you find rarely is getting the developers that are trying to develop as much as fast as possible and the heritage people to somehow work together. That's a very difficult thing. So I think soon as more people realize you get double, triple the benefit rather than wiping out one, you only get one benefit. And people are seeing that more and more.
One of the factors in India which is helping heritage is the courts, Supreme Court.
Supreme Court. That's interesting.
Because
what happened at Taj
Because
Mahal.
one interesting thing about India is that we have what is known as PIL, public interest litigation. Any citizen can go to court and say that government is doing this or some private party is doing this, which is likely to damage the environment. Now, in these matters, courts are very prompt and they are very proactive. Only recently, there were mining operations going on around in Rajasthan or Udaipur. Court had issued a stay, and the stay was violated. Now, court has imposed a fine of 50 crores on the mining operation, plus the loss of revenue to the government, 10 times the loss of revenue they have to put in. Now, that's a very strong
So there was a
step.
public litigation and somebody brought it suit?
Somebody brought the mining operations. Then again, around the Taj, some industries were coming which were likely to do damage. Again, Supreme Court intervened. And similarly, there are so many cases where the Supreme Court has intervened immediately, very prompt action, as a result which heritage has been saved. Or they direct government that, okay, you have to do this. So, although there's a debate that they're entering into executive territory, but there can't be a vacuum. If
But then
government
where
is
does
not
the
doing it.
money go? Does the money go back to the preservation? Of this fine, where does that money go?
No, that doesn't go to preservation, but I mean, it's a deterrent. No, in fact, money, for example, that is raised by visitors going to the Taj, it doesn't go to the Taj.
No, I know.
It goes to the Consolidated Fund of India, and then they.
Exactly.
So that's the system over there, but that's a different issue.
No, because in fact, I think it's an interesting issue that
Yeah.
in fact the money is generated and the money is
But
generated through these things.
that issue
How
has
do
been
you-
taken up several times. It should
Right.
go to this.
Right, right. I mean, in China, do we know, I guess we have colleagues here, whether the court is getting involved in bringing stays like this against development? Do we have a colleague from China? Anybody knows the situation?
If another case I might mention where the
Right.
court intervened, sorry,
Yes.
was in Hampi.
Humpy. No, that's great. Actually, we are coming to that point where I thought I would open it up for a conversation with all of you as well, and then we'll come back to the panelists. But any questions that are burning in your mind and what you want to know about? If there's not a single hand, I will be surprised. Hand back there. Good.
The panel's opinion upon using increase in employment in the community as a measurement for sound development, sound stimulation.
As a measurement of success or the impact, is that what you're saying?
Yes, we're looking for measurements. We were looking for measurements for successful preservation. Is it going too far to say that employment in the community is one of those measurements?
I mean, it's something we've certainly measured in GHF projects, in training programs and so forth. In our new investigation on the economics of heritage, we're looking to go beyond just the tourism numbers, also just beyond real estate, what you might call gentrification numbers. Look at jobs employed, and there are people in this country who, over the last 15 years, have started to count those sorts of jobs and income. And one of the things they come up with, interestingly, is that conservation projects tend to circulate money more locally. So the same dollar or rupee or renminbi goes through the local economy a little more than it would with, say, a highway construction project or franchise chain development.
But it seems to me that going back to what SK was saying, that the economic development is one thing, but if you don't look at also the social and human development, then you get into a problem again. So the problem is how to measure that side, right?
Well, and I think also if we look at things like social financing, for instance, which I think has been especially under investigated as far as heritage is concerned, then if you find ways by which local people are actually getting benefits, development benefits out of something, out of heritage, then they're more likely to invest small amounts of money in being able to upgrade and improve and take care of the place. And that, to me, is a sign that it actually is a sign of success when there's small amounts of local investment as opposed to large amounts of money coming in or large amount of tourism generated. I see that as a way to measure. So it's not, I think we have to also find, to go back to the question of measurement, I think it's very clear to me personally, just from, this is my stand, is that I think we need to find alternative measures, or to, it's how in the environment people have, ways to monetize all kinds of monetizable benefits. I think that unless we find a way to monetize, the many benefits of cultural heritage are not easily monetized. And so unless we're able to find equivalence, it's hard to make an argument based only in terms of revenue or
Right, exactly. Any other? Yes, please.
How do you handle the instinctive, I would imagine, feeling on the part of a villager that the best way to quickly improve their lives is to bring in a bunch of tourists and buses? How do you handle the tension between that and it's really going to be better for you and your children over the long haul to have a different kind of, a more diffuse kind of development?
Well, actually, now you have a lot of counterexamples to show them. I mean, you can go to a villager and say, remember what happened over there? And they didn't get any of the money?
Oh, really?
Yeah, because there are, so we actually, I've experienced that in Yunnan, China, where people saw rapid tourism development in one place and realized they wanted the development, they wanted the money, but they didn't like the way it had happened there because they were losing something else in the process.
Is there enough of a sense of that, you think, that people will be willing to forego the immediate benefit of the instant money for something longer?
Maybe not.
No. Delayed gratification, if people can't actually see it, it's a little harder.
No, in fact, if I can give you a completely contrary example of an area that we were working in Karnataka in India, this was an area immediately around a temple. It's not like a major pilgrim place or anything, but it was a temple that was very meaningful to the local people. And when we were talking about ways to bring in, to look at tourism in the area and so on, and community meetings, there were several local people who were completely opposed to any tourism because they felt that they wanted to follow some very strict kind of orthodox rules of not
Religious
only of
practices.
access, of living around. They did not want meat to be served in the vicinity of the temple. They did not want alcohol to be served in the vicinity of the temple. And they could not imagine tourism that came without these. And so, in fact, what we had to do with sort of much discussion with them, part of the problem is we don't generate enough alternatives. So I think it really, the burden of generating alternatives falls on us as professionals. That's my view on it. And so what we did was to develop alternatives that were acceptable to them. So what we came up instead was a tourism concept that focused on yoga and meditation, on organic food and healthful living. And so the idea was that they did not have to have any alcohol or any meat served in that area if they didn't want to, but they could still have the benefits of tourism. But I'm just giving this as an example that people would actually forego the money of tourism because they valued something else that they saw as their way of living being threatened. So there was a very clear, but this is not always so clear in all cases, for sure.
I might give two examples. One was in Goa. When I was Secretary of Tourism, my minister went there, and off the cuff, he said, we are going to have 25 five-star hotels over there. Immediately, there was a reaction. All charters had to be stopped because there were protests and demonstrations. We don't want, it's going to affect shortages over here, it's going to affect the quality of life. And there was this thing. Then in the Andaman Islands, there was a move to have a casino to bring in more tourists. There's tremendous opposition. We don't want all this. So, you know, the community in many cases is very sensitive to these issues. I mean, don't underestimate.
Yeah.
And they may be, it's not so.
Actually, if I could give one more example on this, because I think it's so dramatic to see this, is in a place in Gujarat, actually, in the Kutch area, where there was a rural tourism proposed, and the community was very, very adamant that they did not want any, it was a village that had very beautiful mud houses with beautiful mirror work and so on. So, you know, for tourists, it would be like a mecca to go and visit this. But the community did not want any outsiders sort of running around loose in their community. And so what they finally, you know, with much back and forth, what they agreed to do, because it was funding to do this, but they were quite willing not to do it, you know, to forego the funding. What they eventually agreed to do was to recreate a second village, exactly a copy of their own, hand-built by the same women who built the houses within their community. But this was a fake village meant only for tourists, so that the tourists who come can live here, stay here, you know, enjoy the, you know, and they will be served by the local people. The benefits go to the local people. They bring the local milk. I mean, it's all, but they're not part of that community, and they don't get to go inside the village. That's completely.
That's a good example.
It's typical Gujarati idea, practical, I want money, keep it aside, you know. So there's a hand over there, I'm sorry. And then we'll come back here, yes.
I'm wondering about a rather large fiscal opportunity. In the United States, the Trust for Public Lands is help raise, but in general, in urban area, you probably do have a middle class that could respond to the appeal about taxing yourself now, using that as the income to pay off the bond, and having real leverage. So I wonder what the panel thinks of that.
That sounds interesting. I think our biggest, the big problem we have is that most of the heritage sites require very little money. It's in the $1 to $2, $3 million range for a fairly major site. To jumpstart and get, basically, we look at three levels. One is, we don't need that much money to stop the threats. That's just the first level. That's called getting it to stability. And then sustainability one is you can get enough money from the gates and the concessions to cover all your operating maintenance costs. And sustainability two is actually how can you keep supporting somebody like John Sanday and that program with the Khmer to keep working on the temple and improving the conservation. But again, it's 2 to 3. So we're looking at like 2 to 3 to 4 million can take care of most of these 500 sites that we've been talking about today. And if we can somehow, and you go to the World Bank and they're not looking at anything under 50 million, 100 million. So we don't have them, and then maybe USAID is kind of a $500,000. You can't really get the job done, and so can we use commercial finance, just a bank loan, guaranteed by the local government, to get that done? I have not seen that happen yet, and I thought your idea. I've heard of another situation where they just taxed cell phones, and every 0.1% went to heritage in. There's those innovative financing, because the kind of top-down, just putting a bunch of money together like the Global Fund for AIDS and attacking, that's another way.
Well, it would be interesting if you can imagine that we would say 1 penny a call or something like that, you know, for everybody. It would go towards heritage. I would love to know which country would actually do that.
Well, in
In
India,
Asia.
Well,
especially.
England has already done
No,
that.
in Asia.
Yeah, in Asia.
Asia.
in India, they've done it for education. They have an education
See,
cess.
people will do it for education.
Yeah.
For-
Would they do it for heritage?
They'll do it for drinking water. Would they do it for, that's the question. And if not, then how do we get there? It's an interesting,
Included in the MDGs.
yeah. I mean, one of the other things I was thinking, Jeff, for you is that it might be interesting that rather than site per site per site, if you want to really scale it up, is to what can you do that is more about creating a movement, which is a different strategy slightly, and convening. That's quite different from going from site to site if you
Yes.
want to scale it up, because somehow people have to come together on this.
You have to do
So-
both.
Yeah.
You have
yeah,
to. You have to show that it can be done.
Right.
And I think the other thing is that one nice thing about technology and what we're seeing is you can see other good examples. People can learn from many other places
Right.
and actually get, like you said, they'll get the best, like that yoga I did, well, right? We don't want that kind of tourists. If they can get, now you can learn, people are traveling a lot more. You can take, we've taken 3 missions from China to Quebec to see their walled city, and then to, Alcatraz to see how they do it. That cross-fertilization of many different ideas is very interesting, and I think, because then people go, oh, I can do that. And then,
And you can have it on the web too, for sure.
have the
online,
web
so
idea,
It's easy,
so.
yeah. There was a hand here, yes.
Just wanted to add on to a few things just about China. Well, first of all, most relevant about what we're seeing. As my own students in Val, I said in my history now, and I said kind of age really in the international.
I think it's a very interesting point you just made, that actually those of you who are interested in this new emphasis on culture should all read President Hu Jintao's speech that he gave in October 2011. And it's a profound piece of reading, because he articulates, on the one hand, that as China grows economically and politically in the international arena, if it doesn't have a cultural weight, it will not look as important or compete with other players. On the other hand, for the internal market, he says, if we don't do this internally because we've had a history, and if everything we do has come from somewhere, so he's also attacking pretty seriously media, communication, Western influence coming in, that somehow if we cannot call ourselves a developed society if we don't have something of our own. And that goes smack against the last 100 years, especially last 60 years, as so much was destroyed. After all, it was Mao Zedong who said, tear down those walls in Beijing, which Zhou Enlai actually tried to not do. So you have a situation, and Cultural Revolution, absolutely. So you have a situation of wanting to revive the culture, but with what? How do you bring it back? So that becomes an entirely different set of issue for intangible cultural property for China. That's a very unique situation, but there's a strong emphasis going forward now that will be interesting to see, and it's very much in the context of international geopolitical power.
And I think just on that note, just to go a step further, like for China right now, it's in the Communist
Right.
Party, and that
So
can be translated.
we must wrap this up, so thank you. Time is running short, and I know you wanted to make a comment, and then we'll come back and see if anyone of you have to say a word. Yeah.
All I want to say is that I think in this gloomy politics, I think we need to pitch
Right.
to more political level and talk to politics.
Well, I think when we talk about the political power of a monument, often it's in negative terms, that it's the jihadis who figure this out. So why come we don't figure this out as to what's the important
yeah.
part of it, So,
Yeah, no, actually, I was going to build on something that Abha pointed out, which is what I was, when you were asking the question and we were talking about China, again, from architecture, the two things that are most striking about the Chinese situation, and when you look at that in relation to the way that we are looking at heritage, is that one, if you look at the the Shanghai Expo, the Chinese Pavilion. I mean, there was absolutely, it's the national narrative.
Right.
And what is the national narrative? And where does heritage figure in the national narrative? And in the Chinese national narrative, you know, the heritage has a very subtle undertone now, even though it's the leading, you know, the main narrative is one of technology. Heritage has come in a way that, you know, that sort of has caught us a little bit unawares perhaps in the West. But the idea that the Chinese pavilion should be so fundamentally based on a very old Chinese building type and technology, you know, it's sort of wooden, you know, toggle structure, you know, is completely, you know, is completely antithetical, of course, to the experience of it inside, which is completely high tech.
And also quite different from what happened at the Olympics.
And very
in
different
Beijing.
from, yes.
Yeah, that's the interesting point, yeah.
And the second thing is, in fact, I had organized a conference in Beijing a year and a half ago where we discussed the idea of sustainability and heritage and looking at urban areas and looking at the urban future of China 2030 and discussing the trajectories of development and seeing what role heritage can have for a sustainable future. And one of the most interesting things that came from the Chinese side was the idea that identity, Chinese-ness, was a very fundamental issue in Chinese architecture and urbanism, which, again, from the Western perspective, where we're talking about architects designing endlessly and, you know, this huge amount of building going on in China, this is a new way of thinking about, you know, the idea of identity and Chinese-ness. And again, how do we measure these?
But I think what it does suggest is the architecture has power. Architecture has aspirations. And it is something about people that makes architecture that way. And what we're trying to do is that the architecture of the past that can continue to have some power, and how do we actually make that happen? And that's one of the reasons you want to do something about that. And on that note, we must finish this so that we can get on to the next part of the program.
Great.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Vishaka.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.